Center for Peacemaking's Need for Courage, Experiment with Peace. Very happy today to have Father Michael McNulty from Marquette University with us today, and there's a whole host of issues that Father's been involved in, but we're going to focus on a couple. We could spend a couple of hours, Father, but let me just talk about a couple of things, and a lot of this is sadly so relevant today. And one of them relates to housing issues, housing as a human right. But I want to start with something a little different. It was something that was referenced in Marquette Today, one of the most recent articles in the magazine, and that's something that you do that I find fascinating because I think it's just so important to basically connect throughout the university. And I'll explain this premise in a second. But it seems like for a number of years, you've gone to a class here on real estate, and you've been brought in by the professors that are putting those classes together to talk to the students about the ethics of real estate, or how there should be ethical concerns regarding real estate. And obviously that touches on issues like redlining, like discrimination in housing, all the issues that we're generally aware of high level. But what are some of the things you try to get across to those students who are in a class that obviously, like a lot of majors, you hope to have a career, do financially well in, but they don't always think about the adjacencies that are so important? What do you talk to them about?
Let me give you just a little background first. George Cashman is the professor that I work with in the business college. And several years ago, George read Matthew Desmond's book, Evicted, and he decided that he needed to incorporate Catholic social teaching into his class. So this was during COVID. And so he and I recorded a Teams session in which I kind of laid out the basics of Catholic social teaching. So George shows that to his class every semester, and then I come in for a Q&A. Yep. And it's an absolutely delightful experience for me. Kids are just terrific.
What sort of questions do the students have? So they've watched the video, and now they're coming in to ask you some specifics. What are sort of the themes behind their questions?
A lot of them are worried about, I'd really, really kind of agree with what you're saying, but, how do we do this practically? And we end up talking about things like zoning policy. Minneapolis, for example, just eliminated single-family housing zones, which makes it possible for people who could not afford a single-family house to find a place to live. So there are ways in which you can, through policy, political activity, and that sort of thing, you can find out how to serve the needs of people whose rights are not being recognized under the present system. And one of the things that comes up over and over again is that people will start out by saying, well, this is the way things are. And I suggest, well, do they have to be that way? What about if we did this instead? And so that's the sort of that's one of the ways that we interact. Another way is that, and this is a characteristic of Americans in general, nobody wants to be taken advantage of. So there is this idea among students, almost all of whom are middle class, of the undeserving poor. People who are out to game the system, who are out to, get an apartment without really having to pay for it and things like that. And there are two things that I say about that. One of them is, first of all, it's not true for most of the people who we are in need of. And secondly, so what? So a few people game the system. What difference does that make? Are you going to sort of lock out all of the people who need the situation, need help in housing, just because a few people are going to game the system? That doesn't make any sense.
It always seems to me that policymakers seem to be more interested in closing those gaps, if they are, than what corporations do by not paying taxes or adversely affecting the environment, you name it, right? So it doesn't seem to be, they don't seem to be as outraged about that for some reason. But you're right, they say the undeserved poor. That's not a good phrase in a positive sense, but it's an accurate phrase, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about the unhoused in our country that we can be absolutely sure of is they have no political power. And so it's not surprising that people who do have political power don't much care about them.
Yeah, and, there's a history behind broadly termed the discrimination in housing. You go back to, I'm originally from New York, Robert Caro's book about Robert Moses, and how he basically adversely affected many people of color in the way he created all the things in New York we've seen. And you've mentioned redlining as an issue which is illegal, but it doesn't always get prosecuted enough or enforced, and certainly not happening with this administration. Yeah. And I mentioned to you before we started recording, I'm in the middle of a book. I actually didn't finish it, but I'm close, called There's No Place for Us. And Brian Goldstein, who was actually an anthropologist, he sat with 5 different families in Atlanta and talked about some of the same things that you've referenced already. The lack of affordable housing, people that are working but can't afford because rents are too high. There's a voucher program. It's a federal program, but sometimes the ads in the paper will say voucher, but then when you call, they say, no, we don't take that sort of thing. So we can go down a big black hole talking about those sorts of things. But so if they don't have any ability politically, I'm going to talk to you later on about a piece you did a couple of years ago about people getting active. What are some of the other resources out there that you're aware of so people can better understand this particular area of concern in the real estate space? Like I said, you've done this video, you do the Q&A. What other reference, and you talked about Evicted as a publication. What other places can students and others that are interested in this area go for more tools, maybe? Well,
there are lots of issues to look at. One of the most important, and one that gets overlooked a lot, is zoning. And I tell students, that zoning boards,
right,
have a lot of power, and zoning boards really can make an impact on people's lives.
Getting involved, or at least paying attention to zoning meetings, as dry as that might sound,
exactly,
has those impacts.
Yeah, there are all kinds of agencies. There's zoning boards, there are school boards. Right. City councils, and it's not really exciting stuff, but it's absolutely crucial.
I'll just say to folks, we will put an article you wrote a couple of years ago about those sorts of ways to get active, and we'll put those in the notes. Because of where we are and what time of year, where we are right now currently, I want to talk to you about immigration. So you've done some work, some both articles and some advocacy pieces on, my words, not yours, but help me out here, the importance of open immigration. Given what's obviously the horrific activities going on in Minneapolis and earlier on in Los Angeles and Chicago, and the disparate views that people have, although I think people are coming around, they're very concerned about the way immigration enforcement has been handled recently. Talk to us a bit about not your notion, but your position regarding the need for open immigration.
Sure. Let me just preface that by saying that I'm from Minneapolis, and my family is there. I just talked to my sister yesterday, and she told the story of how ICE agents are surrounding elementary schools.
Right.
So kids are looking out their windows and seeing masked men with guns.
It's awful.
Open immigration is not the same as open borders. Borders have some important administrative functions to play. But borders do not have the moral heft that they need to be a justification for keeping people out. That's the basic position that I take. And, there's a kind of an extended argument for that, but we probably don't need to go into that here. But my basic idea is that if you look at the Bible, except for not having strange gods, the admonition that appears most often in the Bible is welcome the stranger. I mean, that happens most often in the Bible. So it really baffles me how people who call themselves Christians can possibly say that we don't want immigrants. It really does baffle me. I mean, I can understand people objecting to chaos in the sense that, if there's absolutely no control whatsoever, that's not service to the common good, to have a chaotic system. But it's possible to have a reasonable system that is welcoming instead of excluding. There doesn't seem to be any very good argument that I can see for keeping people out. Unless, if they're criminals or drug dealers or something like that, that's another question. But that's a law enforcement question. That's not an immigration question.
Historically, in terms of immigration, this country and any country that has a relatively positive immigration system has benefited from bringing in workers of all levels, academics, scientists, some of the things that I think if we haven't already, we're going to start to lose, right? if the notion is the way the immigration system has become so fraught here. So there's positive economic, religious, and just human rights reasons to welcome people, right?
A fair number of the Fortune 500 companies have CEOs who are either immigrants or first-generation Americans. So, the idea is somehow or another that immigrants are going to destroy America is just bonkers. I mean, a long time ago, in the 1850s, one of my ancestors jumped ship off the coast of Maine and came ashore illegally because he didn't think he could get through the customs situation that was available in New York at that time. So I'm the heritage of an illegal immigrant.
Yeah, and I've certainly, my grandfather came over from Ireland. He did go through Ellis Island, but still, this is the same theory. So it's one thing to support open immigration, and again, you said it's not open borders. From a policy perspective, I'm not expecting you to know the ins and outs of immigration policy, but we have the DACA program that's being unfairly reduced, if not eliminated, because of lack of support, that sort of thing. We had, they said, I don't know what it was, 10 or 12 years ago, there was a bipartisan proposal by what they called then the Gang of Eight, I guess, and that if that had come into play back then, there would have been a clear path for citizenship. There would have been a right number of administrative judges at the border and all sorts of things. Again, not asking you to get into the deep crevices of policy issues, but what are some of the other things you would recommend, based on people that you've talked to and certainly your experience, to make open immigration something that it's not today? What are some of the things we should actively consider?
Vastly increase the number of ports of entry and staff them properly. We spend so much money on enforcement and virtually nothing on facilitation, which, why do we do that? Why do we spend so much money locking people up when we could be spending that money helping them make a contribution to this country? So vastly increase the number of ports of entry, vastly increase the number of immigration judges, vastly simplify the asylum process, and take the caps off refugee resettlement.
Given where we are now, though, what's your hope for some of this? Again, I know we're right enmeshed in the middle of all this. People seem to be pushing back, at least people that we don't normally hear from.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean there's going to be change overnight, but there's some of the... What gives you some optimism that others that feel the same way that you do about the value of immigration can kind of turn this back to where we were before? Again, not an open border situation, but clear paths and clear opportunities. We want to welcome students coming from foreign countries to come here. We want scientists to be here. How do we make that happen? Besides, again, you've given us some of the key areas of change, but how do you think who out there can run with this, can be a leader in this space besides elected officials? What else are we looking for? Because the church has been, I thought, pretty vocal about this, so that's a positive.
The church has been pretty vocal, but it's been a little bit abstract. Recently, what we see are some more hopeful signs in that, priests and bishops are accompanying people to immigration court.
Right.
That's really an important witness. Nothing's going to happen until we get rid of this administration. Pardon me for being political, but
right.
That's just a fact. As long as the Trump administration is in power, the worst aspects of the American spirit are going to be ascendant.
Do you have any contacts with some of your fellow Jesuits in Latin American countries? Like, what are they telling you about what's happening besides the obvious? I assume that Marquette has some connections with other countries. I know the Center for Peacemaking does a lot of this, so I know that's an obvious statement. But have you had any recent conversations with people in terms of, again, you've made your points clear, but there's other things that we can be doing? What do they feel like on the ground in these other jurisdictions?
My connections have been in El Salvador mostly.
I know you've actually taught there.
Unfortunately, the generation that I knew down there is pretty much all dead at this point.
Yeah.
But what seems to be happening in areas in Latin America is that there is a kind of schizophrenia between trying to accommodate Trump and pushing back against him. Brazil is a good example of a pushback that has been extremely successful. I would suggest to the United States is a detriment because it has given China and other powers free access to areas where they did not have free access before. So, there is that. In El Salvador, I weep for that country because it has had so many ups and downs. The present situation is really difficult to, understand. You have a president who is incredibly popular because he has done one thing that previous administrations have never been able to do. He's broken the gangs, and so people can now live their lives. He's also, incredibly corrupt and essentially indifferent to human rights. So we're in a situation where people are leaving because they have to, and sending them back is in many ways sending them to an extremely dangerous situation, if not certain death.
You've done a tremendous amount of work with the Center for Peacemaking. It's now over a decade in existence. As we close our conversation here, and we could talk about a lot of other things that you've done in your career, what are some of the tips you want to give both students and those of us that care about the goal of achieving peace? We talked earlier to Professor Silva about global justice, and he talked about some of the issues there. I've interviewed Les about issues of violence. Students that come talk to you, you've already made it clear what you tell the real estate students. Those that have already decided we want to be part of the peacemaking process, talk a bit, how do you encourage them? Because it seems very discouraging now. Obviously, changing administrations will help, but there's also a core group in this country that don't seem to both care about immigrants or care about justice. But having said all that, our goals are broad, but our goals are shared by many. So give us some optimism going forward that you would tell students that come to you and say, why should I spend time doing this or that? And how can it improve our communities, our nation, and hopefully the world?
First thing, small steps. Small steps can have big impacts. So be alert for opportunities. The second thing, don't let things pass. If you see or become aware of something that's really offensive, don't just let it go. Make some noise. John Lewis called make good trouble.
Good trouble, yes. That's
right. Making good trouble is really important. One of my diagnoses of something that's really wrong with this country is passivity. You just go along to get along. Let it be. Don't make waves. Democracy can't survive that.
And I mentioned earlier the article that you wrote a few years ago. You told people to get involved. We've already talked about some of that. You talked about zoning boards and school boards and that sort of thing. But don't not vote. Vote, right? Pay attention to what's happening. And if there is common ground with, quote, the other side, whatever that be, find that.
Yeah.
Is also something you recommended.
Yeah. I have seen lots of stories about people who were on absolute opposite sides of an issue who got together over something else. People who couldn't stand each other politically can get together for organizing a community barbecue.
Right.
My experience has been that it's very hard to hate somebody and that's really important. One of the things that getting to know people is really important, but you need to sort of move beyond that. One of the things that I tell the real estate students is that my hope for people who graduate from Marquette University is that they will leave this place being able to care for people they don't know.
I think that's a great way to end the conversation. Thank you, Father McNulty, so much for joining us on the need for courage, and we will put the article that you wrote a few years ago in our notes. But thank you so much for what you do, but also for your